Hello, Tom again. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about nullable types, which in C# is achieved through a generic type. So in your program class, underneath main, we're going to be completing the method that's called part 1 nullable types, and there's some comments there. To do this, what we should do is familiarize ourselves a little bit with the grade class. So if you open up the grade class, let's step through this really quickly. Okay, so this has been coded for you already, although we will be making some modifications to it. The basic idea behind a grade, okay, you can notice that it's clonable, supports the iClonable interface, but the big thing about a grade is that there's a score as well as a highest possible score. So both of these things are done through, there's a private field, my score and my highest possible score, as well as a public property. The get of the property is fairly straightforward. I'm just simply returning the field, and then the set usually has some validation in it. In the case of score, if the value I'm trying to set the score to is greater than the highest possible score, well, that's not going to work, so I'm going to throw an exception. Otherwise, I just set it, and that's good. In terms of the highest possible score, again, getting it is straightforward. In terms of setting it, once again, there's a bit of validation. The first bit of validation is I'm saying that the highest possible score can't be 0 or less. It has to be at least 1. So if it's less than or equal to 0, I'm going to throw an exception. As long as it's not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if the value is greater than or equal to my score. So I'm sort of validating against the score that's already been stored. And if it is, that means it's okay, so I can set it. Otherwise, I'm trying to set the highest possible score to something that's already lower than what's being stored as score. That's not going to work, so I'm going to throw an exception in that case as well. Okay, so that'll keep my hopefully keep my object in a good state. Sorry, I was struggling there. I've got a couple of overloaded conversion operators. So this one here, public static, all operators are static in C#. I've decided to make it explicit, and it's for converting my grade into a double. Okay, so I'm passing in the grade I'm passing in, I'm calling this grade, and I am going to be returning just basically the score divided by the highest possible score. Of course, I have to do some typecasting to avoid integer arithmetic, doing some truncating, but that will do the trick. Okay, and of course I should be returning it as a double as well. So that's pretty straightforward. That'll give me a number. It should be the highest. If it was 100%, it would be 1. If it was 50%, it would be 0.5, that kind of thing. I do the same kind of thing to convert my grade into a letter grade by overloading the char conversion. It's a bit of a stretch because normally we talk about letter grades, we talk about A and A plus, and B and B plus or whatever, and the char data type doesn't support that. So it's a little bit rough, but basically what I do is I establish a letter grade. I've arbitrarily set it to a dash, which actually isn't necessary at this point, but will come in handy later when we modify this. I determine what the percentage grade is by converting the grade into a double and then multiplying it by 100. I round off that percentage grade, which is one of the steps in figuring out what letter grade it should be, and then I just have an if-else chain that determines if it's an A, B, C, D, or if it's an F, and then I return it. In the class, I'm also overriding the system object to string method, so I'm returning a formatted string. I've decided I want to show the score divided by the highest possible score, and then a dash, then the score as a percentage, and then a colon, and then score as a letter. Okay, so that's the formatting that I want when I convert it to a formatted string. And then in terms of cloning, I wanted to support the iClonable interface. I'm just returning a member-wise clone at this particular point. That should do the trick because my fields and properties are all value types, so that's not an issue at all. I have 3 constructors. The default constructor basically calls the parameterized constructor that takes one parameter and passes it 100. The first parameter constructor takes the highest possible score as a parameter and sets the highest possible score property to it. And then finally, I have one that takes two parameters, one for the score and one for the highest possible score. It'll call the single parameter one to set the highest possible score, and then internally it just sets the score. So that's the grade class in a nutshell. Okay, so let's go back to the program class and we'll make use of this grade class. So we'll create a grade object with both a score and a HPS is my little short form for highest possible score in the comments there. So it's a grade object, okay, equals, grade, I'm gonna call it, let's say this is for a test that I took last week. So I'm gonna call it test one, test, say week 1. Let's say today is week 2. So test week 1 equals new grade, and I absolutely bombed it. I got 0 on the test, okay, for whatever reason. Just was not paying attention. The test was out of 25. All right, so there's my first object, pretty straightforward. And then create a grade object without a score yet. So same sort of idea, grade, I'm gonna call it test week 3. And the idea here is that I haven't taken that test yet. So it'll be a new grade. And it's out of 25, but I haven't taken it yet, so I don't have a score yet. Okay, so that's the idea, and because we understand the context of grades, we sort of get the difference between these two things. Like one's a failure and the other is not a failure, it's just nothing yet. Okay, so let's show these two objects. Okay, I'm just going to do a simple console write line here. There we go. Okay, so test week 1 test, which was last week, is test week 1.to string. Week 3, which is next week, is, and we'll see what that comes out with. Let's try running that at this point. So I'll go ahead and run that. We're on the Nullable Types demo, so I'll choose 1. And then test for last week was 0 out of 25, and I failed it. I accept that. But wait a second, the test next week is also 0 out of 25, which is a failure, and I don't like the look of that. I'm sort of saying, well, hang on a second. I want my object to be able to, represent the fact that there isn't a score. And there's a difference between there not being a score and the score being 0. So I'm going to make use of nullable types in the grade class. Okay. So we'll go, I'm going to actually close off a few of these things here. We'll reopen them if we need to. So I'll go back to grade. All right, so the score. I want the score to be nullable. So in terms of the field, right now it's an integer. Instead of that, I'm just going to, I don't know, I'll copy it. And I'll comment out the original so we can preserve it. So in terms of int, I'm going to change the data type from int to nullable, and then in angle brackets, int. Okay. So basically what I'm saying here is that my score is going to be of this nullable type. So nullable is you can see the IntelliSense there, it's defined in system. It's actually like, I'm going to keep saying template, but it's a generic type. It takes in an integer, and basically it allows any sort of value type to be treated as if it could be, also hold a null. So I don't want it to default to 0 anymore. I want it to default to null to begin with. All right. So obviously I've changed it in this one spot. I have to change it in the other spot as well here in terms of the property. So I'm going to change it because a nullable int and an int are not the same thing. So this is where I'm getting this error. Now I can use the term nullable and in angle brackets what value type I want to to use. The other way of doing it in C#, just a little shorthand way, is just putting a question mark after the value type. So those two things they're the exact same type, they're just different syntax. So you can see by putting in that question mark, the underline for score has gone away. In fact, what I'll do is I'm just going to do my copy paste thing again. I'll comment this out, and I'm going to be using int question mark throughout at this point. Okay, so let's carry that through. The next thing I'm going to look at is the constructors again to make sure that this is going to actually make sense. So I'll scroll down to where my constructors are. Now certainly my default constructor, it just calls the parameterized one. This parameterized one is only dealing with highest possible score, so that's not really affected. But then I've got my toInt version. Okay, so I've got an integer score and an integer highest possible score coming in, and I'm setting the score. Now score, you can see, is a nullable type. We just made that change. But the parameter int score is just a regular integer. So that's potentially a problem. Okay, maybe I want to be able to set the score to null. So those two things should match. Okay, now I could do something like typecasting explicitly. I think that's an option for me. Not one that I want to use though. What I want to do is I want to actually change that to the right data type. Okay, so this becomes a nullable int called score. So let's try running at this point. So it did run before, but I'll run it again. I'll choose nullable type, and now all of a sudden I'm getting a argument out of range exception. So it's throwing an exception. It says it's unable to set the highest possible score to 25. It cannot be less than the actual score of blank. The parameter name was highest possible score, and the actual value was 25. So what's going on here? Let's go back and look at program in the nullable types thing. So it probably wasn't this one. It was likely this one. So I'm trying to set it to 25, and it's telling me that 25 is not less than nothing. Okay, so there's a little bit of an issue. So I'm gonna need to look at that property for highest possible score a little bit closer and account for the idea that the my score variable might be null. Okay, so here where I'm saying else if the value is greater than or equal to my score, I'm going to say, well, two things. I'm going to say all right, let's see if we can make sense of this. So the has value property of the nullable type will basically tell us whether or not my score has a value or whether it's null. Okay, this is kind of like saying has value would be kind of like saying, is it not null? So if my score has a value, okay, and then I use the not to reverse that. So I'm saying if my score does not have a value, or the value is greater than or equal to my score, then I'm good to go. Okay, so let's try that out. First, I'm going to save that up. And now I'm going to try running it, and everything should be glorious and beautiful and work perfectly. And oh, I'm disappointed. So we can see it got a little bit further than it did last time. But I have an invalid operation exception now. So it was able to handle the week 1 test no problem, the one that actually had values. But the second one, it was able to create the object no problem and set the highest possible score no problem. But when it came to outputting it, that's when this part happened. This is when it failed, and it failed because of some of the stuff going on in toString and some of the conversion operators. So let's have a look at those. We'll close that off. Okay, so let's go to the toString, which I believe is right here. Now currently I'm sending this, but I don't want to do that anymore. So I'm going to comment this out. Actually, I'll do it this way. and we're going to recode an entirely different approach. So I'm going to do this a little bit more deliberately. I'm going to create a string called converted, and we'll build this actual string. Now, if the string has a value, I basically want to do the same thing I did before. So, okay, if the score is not null, or if my score has a value, then I want converted to be equal to, and this code here, by the way, is literally the same that I had before. I'll make it easier for you to see that. Now, if it doesn't have a value, I want to handle it differently. So essentially all I'm going to do is show a dash instead of the score. I will still show the highest possible score, but I won't show the percentage or letter grade version of the grade. It just doesn't make any sense in that context. Okay, so that's the two versions of the string I'll have depending on whether or not the score has a value. And then of course what I need to do is I need to return the string. Okay, there we go. So we'll try running that. Nullable types. Okay, now I can see the difference between my week 1 test and my week 3 test, and it's kind of showing me the difference in a more appropriate way. Now, really, what I did here by not dealing with the conversion to a double and conversion to a letter grade, I'm kind of I need to look at those a little bit more closely. So let's test out to see if they work. Okay, so I'll go back to program here, and underneath where it says show the object without the score as a double and as a char. Okay, I'll just do a couple of console write lines there, and explicitly showing it as a character, explicitly showing it as a double. And let's try running that. All right, so we'll run it like this. Option 1. And oh no, invalid operation exception again. So let's have a look at those two. Okay, so back to the grade class. Let's look at the double one first, because the character one actually calls double, so we'll need to deal with that one first. So right now it's basically assuming that my score has a value in order for this to work, and it doesn't. I can't divide null by some value, so I have to change this. The change is quite simple. I could do an if statement. If my score has value, do one thing, and if it doesn't, do another thing. But I could also use the question mark operator. So I'm going to say this this grade dot my score, okay, or if it's null, that's how you kind of read that, then I want to deal with 0. Okay, so basically the way that this works is that it's going to look at my score. If my score has a value, then it'll use that value. If my score does not have a value, okay, it's going to use this value instead. So I'll run that just as is. We'll do option 1 here, and you can see it's no longer throwing an exception, which is good, okay, and it's just coming up as 0. Now, we might say, oh, I want it to come up as something other than 0 or throw an exception or whatever. That's just the way that we've coded it to work. The character is still coming up as fail, so that one will fix up as well. Okay, this will be a fairly easy fix. I've got my letter grade. It's right now defaulting to a dash, which it was never actually called upon before. Now I'm going to actually call upon that. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an if statement. So if this grade dot my score dot has value, and I want to do all of this stuff. Okay. I don't even need an else because I'm setting it to a dash. So if it doesn't have a value, it's not going to do any of this stuff. It's just going to return a dash. So let's try running that. Okay, so this is getting closer to what I want. Okay, so if as a character it's just a dash. As a double, it's still coming up as a 0 because I'm converting it to a non-nullable, like a regular double. So that's kind of unavoidable. but at least it's not throwing an exception in that particular case. So that wraps up this video, a little bit of a longer one on nullable types. In the next video, we're going to be dealing with part 2, which is looking at one of the generic collection types that's built into .NET. Thank you very much.